Hey everyone, I am your host Peter Zablocki and you're listening to History Shorts. I hope everyone's having a great day so far and thank you for making this show a small part of that. If you'd like to help me out with a small gesture, please leave History Shorts a rating or a review and click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. For sources and books used as the basis for these episodes, how to advertise on the show, and other information such as a list of our upcoming guests on the Conversation series, or a link to our Patreon account where you can listen to exclusive episodes not heard here, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Having said all of that, few cases have captivated public imagination as intensely as that of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. An American homeopath residing in London, Crippen was convicted and executed in 1910 for the murder of his wife Cora. The sensational nature of the case, combined with its dramatic elements, an illicit affair, a dismembered body, and a transatlantic chase, cemented its place in crime lore. Yet, over a century later, questions linger about the integrity of the investigation and trial, prompting some to label it as a potential miscarriage of justice. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This was the twilight of the British Empire's golden age. London was the center of global commerce and culture. The police force was increasingly professionalized. Forensic science was just beginning to capture the public's imagination. And of course, the shadow of Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized London's East End only 2 decades earlier, still loomed large. The Crippen case would soon be mentioned in the same breath, not because of the gruesomeness of the crime, but because of how a public hungry for sensation turned a strange disappearance into a sensational murder. Hawley Harvey Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan in 1862. Trained in homeopathy, he worked briefly in the United States before moving to London to represent the Munion Homeopathic Remedies Company. His second wife, Cora Turner, was a Brooklyn-born aspiring opera singer who styled herself as Belle Elmore. Their relationship was anything but harmonious. While Crippen was described by acquaintances as quiet, studious, and even timid, Cora was flamboyant, socially ambitious, and at times domineering. By 1910, their marriage had grown toxic. Cora's dreams of stardom were fading, and her relationships with other men, at least one of which may have been physical, added tension to their home at 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Camden. Meanwhile, Crippen began an affair with his young secretary, Ethel Lee Neve. This fact also would later color public opinion and jury sentiment. A meek, cuckold man who murders his overbearing wife to be with his lover. That was the storyline the press seized upon with glee. In January 1910, Cora disappeared. Crippen told friends she had returned to the United States, then later altered the story to say that she had died abroad. He even claimed she was cremated. This web of shifting stories, combined with Ethel moving into the marital home and wearing Cora's jewelry, raised suspicions. Cora's friends, particularly fellow members of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, pressed Scotland Yard. Inspector Walter Dew, who had played a role in investigating Jack the Ripper, was assigned to the case. A search of the house initially found nothing, but after Crippen admitted to lying about Cora's death, Dew returned with greater urgency. During the second search, Dew's team discovered something chilling under the floor of the coal cellar: human remains. But this wasn't a complete body. It was a decomposing torso, headless, limbless, and lacking skeletal structure. Forensics at the time struggled to identify it. There was no DNA testing, no reliable fingerprinting. The Crown's case would rely heavily on the interpretation of that flesh and on the character of the man that they had already suspected. By the time the remains were discovered, Crippen and Leneve had fled London. Their disappearance and the revelation of the body set off a media frenzy. But what happened next would become the most technologically significant moment in the case. The SS Montrose was a passenger liner heading to Canada. On board was a curious pair, a man and a teenage boy who shared a cabin. The ship's captain, Henry Kendall, grew suspicious. Was this Crippen and his mistress, disguised as father and son? Kendall used the ship's new Marconi wireless to contact British authorities. It was the first time in history that a wireless telegraph was used to apprehend a fugitive. Scotland Yard responded by sending Inspector Dew on a faster vessel, the SS Laurentic. Dew arrived in Canada before the Montrose docked and arrested Crippen and Ethel before they could disembark. The arrest, reported in real time, made international headlines. Crippen had become a media villain of epic proportions. Crippen's trial at the Old Bailey in October of 1910 was a public spectacle. Every detail of his demeanor, clothing, and even facial expressions was reported with lurid enthusiasm. The prosecution built its case on circumstantial and forensic evidence. The Crown's star witness was Bernard Spilsbury, a young but already prominent pathologist. Spilsbury claimed that the flesh bore a scar consistent with one Cora had on her abdomen. He also testified that the remains contained traces of a drug known to sedate its victims. The clincher? A fragment of men's pajama top buried with the torso matched a pair still in the Crippen home. But the defense, led by Arthur Newton, pointed out massive flaws. The headless torso had no clear evidence of gender. Pillsbury's method of identifying the scar based on tissue and appearance was subjective. Worse, hair follicles were found in the supposed scar, which most medical experts would agree should not exist in healed scar tissue. Still, Crippen's credibility was eroded by his affair with Ethel, his lies to the police, and his cowardly flight. It took the jury just 27 minutes to return a guilty verdict. On November 23, 1910, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was hanged at the Pentonville prison. Ethel was acquitted and later moved to Australia, living under an assumed name. The case seemed closed for nearly a century, but in 2007, scientists at Michigan State University obtained tissue samples believed to be from the original remains. Using mitochondrial DNA testing, a technique unavailable in 1910, they compared the tissue with samples from Cora's living maternal relatives. The result was shocking. The DNA did not match. Moreover, Y chromosome analysis hinted that the remains might be that of a male. This was deeply problematic. If the remains weren't Cora's, then who was buried in Crippen's basement? And more importantly, if it wasn't her, was there a murder at all? The pajama top evidence was also thrown into question. Historian and biographer David James Smith suggested that police could have planted the garment fragment to bolster their case. These revelations fueled a growing chorus of voices who believed Crippen had been wrongfully convicted, railroaded by tabloid pressure, a high-profile chase, and an overconfident prosecution. They labeled it a mistrial, not in the technical legal sense, but as a moral failing of justice. A closer look at Spilsbury's role raises uncomfortable questions as well. While lauded as the father of British forensic pathology, Spilsbury wielded immense influence in the courtroom. His confident manner, scientific vocabulary, and authoritative tone made him an almost unchallengeable witness. Yet in retrospect, many of his conclusions, particularly in the Crippen trial, were more interpretive than real evidence. Scar identification from skin tissue, reading of content from decomposed organs, and visual matches of clothing all relied heavily on Spilsbury's word. He was a product of his time, a science that was still learning to distinguish between hard data and persuasive hypotheses. But in Crippen's case, it's likely that the courtroom gravitas contributed decisively to the guilty verdict, adding another layer to the mystery. Reports emerged in 1930s and 40s claiming that Cora had been in the US, living under a new name, possibly with one of her lovers. None of these sightings were confirmed, but it is not impossible. Cora may have actually fled, staged her own disappearance, and left Crippen to face the music. Her behavior had always been flamboyant and theatrical. A vanishing act wouldn't be out of character. And if true, Crippen's lie about her death might have been a desperate bid to avoid scandal, not a cover for murder. Some writers, particularly in tabloids, have called Crippen the other Jack the Ripper. This is more about narrative branding than factual connection. Crippen's crime, if he committed it, of course, was domestic, not serial, private, nor public. But like Jack the Ripper, his story captivated the public, inspired media frenzy, and challenged the limits of forensic science in the era. What unites the two cases is obviously the mystery. One man was never found, the other may never have been guilty. So, over a century later, the only certainty is that the evidence we now possess suggests serious flaws in the original trial. What we do know is that in the coal cellar of 39 Hilldrop Crescent, a body was found. But whose body, and who put it there? Well, these are questions we may never fully answer. Thanks for listening.